"Don't touch that dog, Nate. It's already halfway to dead." The voice belonged to an old gas station clerk named Reed, who leaned out of the doorway with a coffee cup and a scowl, pointing toward the dumpster. The snow was falling steadily, now turning the gravel lot into a mush of gray slush. But Nate, a mechanic with grease still on his fingers and sorrow burning behind his eyes, ignored the warning. He crouched beside the crumpled golden retriever lying on her side behind the trash bins. Her ribs showed through her muddy coat, and a faint, uneven wheeze escaped her throat. But what hit Nate hardest wasn't her condition. It was the 4 tiny bodies curled against her belly, so still, so quiet, they almost looked like discarded. "Rags, they're alive," he muttered, pressing 2 fingers to one of the puppies. A pulse, weak, but there, barely. Reed just shook his head and turned away. Dogs like that ain't worth the effort. But Nate wasn't listening, not anymore. He stripped off his jacket and gently wrapped the mother dog first. Her eyes fluttered open at the touch, her cracked nose twitching as if to ask whether this was real, whether someone was really touching her without kicking, without shouting. "Easy, girl," Nate whispered. "You held on this long. You don't get to quit now." Inside his old pickup, he laid her down gently across the back seat and placed the puppies beside her. The truck smelled like diesel and pine air freshener, but it was warm. Warmer than death. He didn't drive to a vet. He knew what they'd say. Too far gone. No funds, no paperwork. Instead, he drove home. A one-room cabin tucked behind the mountains, where the only sound was the wind slicing through trees and the occasional echo of memory. Nate hadn't expected to live with anyone again, especially not after the fire. He'd lost his own dog in that blaze, a golden retriever named Mavis, who never made it out of the smoke. After that, the silence in the cabin had become a kind of punishment. But tonight, that silence broke. The mother dog, who he started calling May, whimpered as he cleaned her wounds with a warm rag. She didn't fight. She barely had the strength to blink. But when Nate nudged one of the puppies closer to her side, her paw twitched. And then, slowly, she pulled it in. It was instinct. It was love. And it was a miracle she had any left. That night, Nate set up a space beside the old fireplace. He laid out towels and filled a bowl with water. May couldn't lift her head to drink, so he dipped his fingers in and let the droplets fall gently into her mouth. Every few hours, he turned the puppies to make sure they were warm. One of them, the runt, barely moved. Nate stayed up all night for that one, and in the darkness, as the wind howled against the walls, a strange feeling settled into Nate's chest. Not hope, not yet, but something close to it. By morning, May's eyes were clearer. She lifted her head, just an inch, just enough to see the man who refused to let her die. "Hey," Nate said quietly, kneeling beside her. "You made it through the night." She looked at him, then at her pups, and gave a soft, dry huff. Something changed in Nate that morning, not because May was healing, but because for the first time in years, someone needed him again, and not for what he could fix, or build, or repair, but just for being there. That afternoon, Nate drove back into town to get supplies, formula, bandages, anything the clerk might have behind the counter. Reed raised an eyebrow when he saw him. "You actually took that mutt home?" he asked. Nate didn't answer. He just looked Reed dead in the eyes and said, "Sometimes the ones left behind are the only ones worth saving." When he got back to the cabin, May had somehow dragged herself closer to the fire. The pups were nestled tighter around her now, breathing a little heavier, twitching in their sleep like they were dreaming for the first time in days. Nate sat down beside them and reached for his old kettle. It was going to be a long road ahead, but he wasn't going anywhere, not this time, and neither was May. The storm that evening was unrelenting. Thick sheets of sleet beat down on the cabin roof like a warning, but inside, the world was soft, quiet, and trembling with fragile hope. May still couldn't stand. Her muscles had grown stiff, and her limbs trembled if she even tried to shift her weight. But the way her nose nudged each of the puppies now, with care, with presence, was proof enough for Nate that she hadn't given up. He sat cross-legged on the floor near the hearth, the flames flickering shadows onto his face. A puppy squeaked softly, its tiny legs kicking out, hungry again. Nate reached for the bottle, gently warmed, and guided it to the pup's mouth. The capper moment. The tip touched. The puppy latched on. His hands shook slightly, not from fatigue, but from something he hadn't felt in years, responsibility that mattered. May watched him closely. There was pain in her eyes, no doubt, but also the faintest, trace of gratitude, the kind that went beyond words or whines. She didn't flinch when he reached for her side to rub a warm towel over her ribs. Instead, she let out a soft groan, as if finally surrendering to the idea that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. Later that night, Nate found an old photo tucked behind a dusty book on the shelf. Him and Mavis, his golden retriever, standing outside the burned-down garage where it all began. Mavis had been a protector, a shadow, a soul stitched to his. When the fire broke out, Nate made it out first. He'd turned around for her, but smoke had swallowed the hallway. By the time the firemen arrived, it was too late. He hadn't forgiven himself for that. Not once. But now, watching May curl around her puppies despite her pain, Nate began to feel a strange ache behind his ribs. Not guilt, not yet forgiveness, but the stirring of something that had long been buried under ash. The next morning, the smallest puppy, the runt, wasn't breathing right. Its chest rose, then paused, then rose again like it was searching for rhythm and failing. Panic gripped Nate's throat. He had held this one the most. He had whispered to it while the others slept. No, not this one. Not now. He grabbed a cloth and rubbed the tiny body briskly, trying to stimulate breath, like he'd read once in some emergency guide. May whimpered low, her head lifting for the first time in hours. Her eyes locked on his, and in them, there was no blame, only trust. That was worse somehow, because what if he failed again? Come on, little guy, Nate muttered, his voice cracking. You don't get to give up. A moment passed, then another, and then a cough, the tiniest sputter of sound, weak and barely. There, but enough. The puppy inhaled, slowly but surely, and resumed breathing. Nate collapsed back, pressing his hands to his face, then looking up at May. She blinked slowly, and he could swear that if she could speak, she would have said thank you. Later that day, Nate drove into town again, this time not just for supplies. He wanted answers. There was no chip on May, no tag, no records. No one had come looking for her or the puppies. Reed mentioned that some trucker had abandoned a box near the backlot a week ago, but no one had bothered checking it. That box, half collapsed and full of teeth marks, was where Nate had first seen the pups lying beside their unconscious mother. That hit him harder than expected. Someone had dumped her, discarded her like trash, even as she fought to stay alive, for her litter. And yet she held on, not for herself, but for them. That night, when he returned to the cabin, May tried to stand. Her legs shook, her paws slid on the wooden floor, and Nate jumped up to steady her. But she didn't collapse. This time, she stood, wobbly, panting but standing. He knelt in front of her, eyes brimming. You're something else, girl. She leaned forward and licked the back of his hand, and in that moment, everything shifted. It wasn't just about saving them anymore. It was about letting them save him back. Nate barely slept that night. Every time one of the puppies whimpered, or May shifted restlessly on the blanket, he was up, checking on them, gently adjusting the towel, replacing the hot water bottle, whispering quiet reassurance. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting soft light over the cabin walls. In that fragile silence, Nate found himself whispering things he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Apologies to Mavis, regrets, bits of himself he thought he'd buried, under layers of bitterness and isolation. By dawn, the snow had finally stopped, leaving behind a world frozen in silence. Frost clung to the window panes like delicate lace. May was curled tight around her puppies, her breathing slow but steady. Nate's jacket, covered in fur and wrinkled from the long night, lay abandoned on the chair. His focus was entirely on preparing formula for the morning feed. The runt, the one who nearly didn't make it, was stronger today, nuzzling eagerly against his hand when he reached into the box. But something was off. Nate stood and moved toward May. She hadn't lifted her head like she usually did. Her ears didn't twitch at the sound of his steps. Gently he knelt beside her. Her body was warm, but her breathing, it was labored. Again, shallow, strained. May, he whispered, reaching to brush her ear. She blinked at him, slowly, but her tail didn't move. Nate's stomach tightened. He grabbed a flashlight and carefully examined her gums. Pale, too pale. Something inside him snapped to attention. The infection hadn't been stopped. It had only paused. Maybe the wounds were deeper than they'd realized. Maybe she had internal bleeding. Maybe. He didn't waste another second. Wrapping May gently in a thick wool blanket, he placed her in the passenger seat of his truck, then tucked the puppies in a lined basket and placed them on the floor of the cabin. with a heater blowing toward them. His heart ached as he closed the cabin door behind him. He had to take May alone. The risk was too high on icy roads with so many small lives in tow. The truck roared to life. May let out a small groan from the seat beside him. Nate reached over, squeezing her paw, one hand still on the wheel. "Hold on, girl. Just hold on." He drove faster than he should have on snow-drenched roads, praying with every curve that he wouldn't skid off into the ditch. The vet clinic was 20 minutes away on a good day. Today it felt like 20 hours. The receptionist at the clinic recognized him from last week and didn't ask questions. May was rushed into the back, a tech taking vitals and murmuring calmly as the door swung shut. Nate stood alone in the waiting room, fists clenched, the smell of antiseptic making his throat burn. He thought of that night in the burning garage again, the sound of Mavis barking through the flames, and how helpless he had felt when they pulled him back but not her. He couldn't go through that again, not this time. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Ellis came out, her face serious but not panicked. "She's septic, Nate. We'll need to start fluids and antibiotics immediately. We're going to fight this." Nate nodded, swallowing hard. "Do whatever you have to." Back at the cabin, the puppies stirred, hungry and unaware that their mother was now fighting a battle she might not win. Nate fed them quietly, one by one, careful with each drop. When the last one dozed off against his wrist, he sat back, shoulders sagging. That's when he noticed it. A scrap of something inside the box they'd been found in, stuffed beneath the blanket. He pulled it free, a piece of cloth, once part of a t-shirt, crudely torn and stained. But there was writing on it, just 2 words, in smudged red marker. "Forgive me." Nate stared at it, breath catching. Someone had abandoned May deliberately, but not without guilt. That didn't make it right. It didn't make it okay. But for the first time, he wondered if whoever left her there had once loved her, had no choice, or thought they didn't. 2 hours later, his phone buzzed. Dr. Ellis. He hesitated before answering, his pulse thundering in his ears. "She's stable," the vet said, her voice firm and steady. "She made it through the worst of it. She's not out of the woods yet, but she's a fighter." Nate closed his eyes, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Thank you," he said. "Just thank you." As he hung up, one of the puppies, ears still folded, eyes barely open, rolled toward his chest and let out a tiny, contented sigh. Nate smiled faintly, tracing a finger along its warm back. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. He was ready to fight for something good. Under the pale blue light of dawn, the air outside Nate's cabin was still, but inside, life had returned. The puppies were stirring, their tiny cries soft and rhythmic, as though sensing that something important had changed overnight. May was still at the clinic, but the silence she had left behind wasn't hollow. It was brimming with hope. Nate moved carefully around the small room, boiling water for fresh bottles, adjusting the heater near the box where the puppies slept. Every motion now had meaning. There was no more doubt in him. He was in this completely. He had planned to head to the clinic at noon to check on May's condition, but that changed when the phone rang just after 8. It was Dr. Ellis again. "She's alert," she said, sounding surprised and relieved. "Not just stable, alert." She lifted her head when I came in, and when I said your name, her ears moved. Nate had already grabbed his coat before she finished the sentence. Driving back into town, the snow glimmered in sunlight, but it didn't slow him this time. The roads were clear, and his mind sharper than it had been in years. Not long ago, he was a man who counted losses. Now, somehow, he was learning to hold on to what he still had. When Nate stepped into the clinic room, May was lying on a thick pad, hooked to an IV, her fur cleaned, and her eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. But when she saw him, her tail tapped, twice on the floor. That sound, just 2 soft thumps, nearly undid him. He knelt beside her and rested his hand on her head. "You came back, girl," he whispered. "You held on." May leaned into his touch, and something shifted in Nate. A quiet promise formed between them. No matter what came next, he wouldn't let her go through it alone. But while May was healing, something else tugged at Nate's mind. That note, the scrap of cloth with "Forgive me" scrawled across it. It haunted him. Someone had left May and her puppies in the middle of a snowstorm, but not without remorse. It didn't excuse what happened, but it opened questions he couldn't ignore. On his way home, he stopped by the edge of the woods where he'd first found May. He retraced his steps, eyes scanning the snow-dusted path, looking for something, anything, he might have missed. And then he saw it. Near the base of a tree, half buried in old snow, was a small collar, pink, frayed, and tiny. A tag hung crookedly from it, rusted but still readable. Lily. Below the name, there was a phone number. Nate stared at it, breath caught in his throat. Lily must have been one of the puppies, maybe the runt. Maybe someone had owned May before, maybe even loved her, before everything went wrong. He hesitated, unsure what to do. Was it even worth calling? What kind of person leaves a dying dog, and her babies in the cold? But something deeper urged him on. People change. Sometimes they fall, sometimes they run, but some of them just need a chance to explain. He dialed the number. It rang 4 times before a shaky voice answered. Hello? Nate's mouth felt dry. I found something. A collar. Belonged to a golden retriever and her pups, out by Ridgewood Pines. There was a long pause, then a gasp, choked, tearful. You found May? So her name had never been forgotten. Gear. Woman on the other end, Claire, told him everything in fragments. She'd lost her home, her husband, then her job. She'd tried to keep May and the puppies with her in an abandoned cabin for a while, feeding them scraps, sleeping on the floor. But when May got sick and the snow rolled in, she panicked. She thought they were all going to die anyway, so she bundled them in the box and left them near the road, hoping someone kind would find them. I was wrong, she said through tears, but I didn't know what else to do. I didn't stop thinking about them. Every night, Nate didn't forgive her right away. But he didn't hang up either. He offered her a choice. You can come meet them, he said, but not as a stranger. If you're ready to take responsibility, not just feel sorry. Claire agreed. The following morning, she arrived at the cabin. May, though still weak, stood on trembling legs when she saw her. Her tail wagged. The puppies crawled toward the warmth in her voice. Claire fell to her knees, sobbing, her hands trembling as she held the smallest one. Lily. Nate watched from the doorway. He still had questions, and there would be healing yet to do. But in that moment, he saw something else. Not just guilt, but love, desperate to be forgiven. And maybe that was the beginning of something worth holding on to. Because sometimes, a dog doesn't just bring you pain or joy. Sometimes, she brings you back to the parts of yourself you thought you'd lost forever. That evening, as the wind whistled quietly through the pines behind the cabin, Nate stood outside the door, arms folded, watching the golden sky melt into deeper shades of twilight. Inside, the fire crackled softly. The puppies had finally drifted off into a warm pile of sleep after nursing, their bellies round and safe. May rested beside them, her head gently nudging the smallest one, Lily, closer into her chest. The soft flicker of the flames danced across their golden fur like a whisper of peace that had taken too long to arrive. Claire sat on the worn couch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold in her palms. She had been quiet for most of the day, only speaking when necessary, as if unsure of her place among the life she'd once left behind. But May had forgiven her in a way Nate still couldn't fully explain. The way she'd looked at Claire, tail wagging, soft eyes wide, wasn't just recognition. It was understanding. It was grace. Nate didn't yet know if he could extend that same grace. But he no longer felt the ache of bitterness in his chest when she was near. That, for now, was enough. He finally stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Claire looked up, her expression still tentative. She had told her story the night before, one of love lost, of desperation, and a life that had spiraled out of her control. It didn't justify what she had done, but it gave context to her pain. And Nate, who had spent so many years trapped inside his own silence, had finally found the strength to listen. She remembers you, he said, nodding toward May. That means something. Claire smiled faintly, tears in her eyes. I don't deserve it. Maybe not, Nate replied. But that doesn't mean you don't have to try. The next morning was clearer than most. Blue skies stretched wide over the snow-covered hills, and the forest behind the cabin was calm. Nate loaded May and the puppies into his old truck with Claire's help, and they drove to the nearby animal sanctuary. It wasn't a goodbye, more of a step forward. The puppies were strong now, nearly ready for adoption, and the sanctuary had the resources to give them the medical attention and space they needed. May, too, would get a proper checkup and recovery plan from specialists. Before leaving, Nate knelt beside May once more, his hand resting on her side. You changed everything, girl. I don't think you even know how much. Her eyes were soft, golden, grateful. She didn't need to speak. She had done enough. More than anyone had ever asked. Back at the cabin, the silence felt different now. Not empty, not lost, just quieter, like something had been laid to rest. Claire stayed behind for a while. She asked if she could help with the repairs Nate had started months ago but never finished, fixing the porch railing, painting the old shed, and slowly, without saying it, they started sharing the weight of the days again. One evening, after they had finished chopping firewood, Claire set down her axe and looked toward the horizon. "You ever wonder," she asked, "what would have happened if you hadn't found them?" Nate looked down, then back at the soft outline of the forest. "Yeah, I think about it more than I want to. And," he gave a half-smile, "I think we all would have stayed lost. May, the pups, maybe even me." Claire nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I think I've been lost for a long time, too." "You're not anymore," Nate said gently. "You're here. That counts for something." As spring approached, the snow began to retreat from the ground. Green returned in quiet, persistent ways, blades of grass pushing through the thaw, birds singing again at dawn. The cabin, once marked by grief and stillness, came alive with small changes. Hope, Nate realized, never comes in grand declarations. It grows in the cracks we didn't notice before, and when it does, it changes everything. One day, a letter arrived from the sanctuary. All the puppies had been adopted by loving families. One had even been trained as a therapy dog for a young girl with anxiety. May had recovered well, and though she was older now, they believed she still had a few good years left. They asked if Nate, or Claire, would consider taking her back. He didn't hesitate. When May returned to the cabin a week later, her tail wagged slow but steady. The look in her eyes was the same one from that first freezing night, the night she'd fought to stay alive for her babies. This time, though, there was no fear, only peace. That night, as Nate, Claire, and May sat under the stars outside the cabin, a quiet joy wrapped around them like a blanket. The world didn't feel perfect, but it didn't need to be. They had made it through the storm. Sometimes, it takes a dying dog to remind broken people how to live again. And sometimes, it takes choosing to stay, when every part of you wants to run, to finally understand what it means to be home.